Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin session 9-1 from now on. The moderator of the session will be Director Hong Min of North Korean Research Division of Korea Institute for National Unification, or KINU. You have the floor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Hong Min from KINU. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend today's session. This session focuses on North Korea's response in the pandemic era and social and economic structure. What this topic means is that for the past 2.7 years, North Korea is suffering from COVID-19. It has closed down its borders. And the COVID-19 pandemic is not very much limited to just North Korea, but it is closely related with the dynamics on the Korean Peninsula, and it also reveals an uncertain side to the Korean Peninsula. So, through today's session, we hope to discuss about the measures taken by DPRK to respond to COVID-19. And we will also have a look at the social and economic structure and its evolution, and also changes taking place in terms of social class, a social trend taking place in North Korea. Not only that, we will also discuss what kind of policies are being implemented to secure a future labor and workforce. We will try to draw some implications from the discussions and presentations. We have 3 presentations in store for you. First, the presentation will be about the spatial understanding of the North Korea and South Korea border. There are some academic analysis included, and I'm sure that lots of questions will be addressed and raised by the presentation. It's not just about taking stock of the COVID situation of DPRK, but how we interpret the lockdown of DPRK in light of COVID-19 pandemic. Second presentation is about the change in the social structure and the rise of the middle class. So, of course, there has been a lot of changes and evolution about the social class and the market economy in North Korea. The presenter is going to talk about the structure of the social class and delve deeper into its meaning. And last but not least, there is going to be a presentation about building a future workforce for North Korea. So there are generations that have benefited from many different policies of North Korea, and we're going to have a look at North Korea from the human capital perspective. Now, all of these 3 presenters, all of these projects are currently, and researches are being done at KINU, and they will be presented in a form of report sooner or later. So there are also intermediary findings as well. So now I'd like to turn it over to our 3 presenters. We also have 3 discussants here today. First of all, Professor Park Bae-gyun from Seoul National University. Please greet the audience. And from Institute for Peace and Unification Studies of SNU, we have Professor Kim Bi-Fellow. And from the Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia, we have Senior Research Fellow Mimura Mitsuhiro joining us online. The presenters will give the presentation for 15 minutes, discussants 8 to 10 minutes. We also have on-site participants, but also online participants. If you have any questions or comments regarding the presentation, our online participants, you can also share them through the comment section. in the online so that we can share and address those questions later on. Now let us move on to the first presentation.
First presenter will be given by Dr. Hwang Jin-tae at KINU, and his presentation is on spatial understanding of North Korea's border blockage amid COVID-19. Hello, as introduced, my name is Hwang Jin-tae from KINU. So today I would like to talk about spatial understanding of North Korea's border blockage amid COVID-19. Now I'd like to share my concerns with regards to this issue with you today. So as said by Mr. Hong, for nearly 3 years or 2 years and 8 months to be exact, North Korea has fully closed down its borders. It's the only country in the world not to open its borders after COVID-19. There were strong sanctions even before COVID-19, and therefore supply of external goods was difficult for North Korea, which has wreaked havoc on North Korea's economy and people's livelihoods. And many researchers and media outlets who take a hawkish stance mentioned about the possibility of a regime collapse. Now, we always look at North Korea in the frame of an abnormal state. Then, should we also take on that perspective to understand North Korea's border blockage that's prolonging? So if you are to just say that this border blockage is due to the fact that North Korean state is abnormal, I don't think that should be the focus. I think we really need to look at the internal affairs of North Korea to understand this phenomena. So as Mr. Hong said before, all the presentations are based on ongoing researches. So rather than disclosing everything in the research, I'm just going to talk about whether the current frame that through which we view North Korea is enough, and how we can understand North Korea not only through the structure and the power of the elites, but also based on its geographical location, the fact that it's next to China, and also a more spatial understanding of North Korea and the rich stories that are contained within that space. Once we complete our research and the papers come out, I hope I will be able to share more details with you in the future. So, in end of May in 2020, the Rodong Shinmun stated what's written in the presentation here. And it's an interview with someone from the Emergency Anti-Epidemic Command in North Korea. It's very unusual for officials to actually make direct remarks like this on a state news media. And before this, there were no mentioning of what the Korean people think about the COVID-19. But as you know, North Korea, for the first time last year, admitted its first outbreak of COVID-19, but quickly also announced that they have managed to contain the disease. And afterwards, we see this article in Rodong Shinmun. Now, this interview said that given the fast spread of the virus and uncertain incubation period and lack of scientific understanding of the virus are the reasons behind North Korea's decision to close its borders early, then how come North Korea did not opt for a partial closure but a full closure? Now, under a limited knowledge of the virus, if North Korea were to fully close down its border, it may suffer economic damages for some time, but the benefit from blocking the virus from penetrating North Korea would be greater. That's the decision that North Korea made. But of course, it probably did not take into account that the pandemic would be prolonged for this long. And now, looking at these interviews and so on, it appears that North Korea's quarantine measures are different from that of other states and even abnormal. But is it really okay for us to take on that perspective as we observe North Korea. Now, before it proclaimed a national emergency quarantine system, North Korea first, so before North Korea provided the national emergency quarantine system, it did mention some areas where the pandemic broke out, especially areas in China. So I made them into charts. So after North Korea obtained the information that there are outbreaks of COVID-19 in China, it closed down its borders in January 22nd and also proclaimed the national emergency anti-epidemic system in January 30th. And many experts wrote columns about a pandemic in its Rodong Shinmun, and we could feel a sense of urgency that North Korea had with regards to this matter. Based on those documents and materials that are available. Then why did North Korea swiftly close down its border? Not partially, but fully. And there are probably not only economic but healthcare aspects that were considered. But within the zero corona policy, the Rodong Shinmun and other news outlets did not mention about how inferior their healthcare facilities are. But once things began to settle within North Korea, as you can see in this article, it admits for the first time that North Korean authorities are aware of the poor health structure inside the regime. If situations did become aggravated in North Korea, I don't think that North Korea would have indirectly implied that North Korea's health infrastructure is poor. These newspaper articles actually is a testament to the fact that a full lockdown of the border was rather a success for North Korea. Now, it's been nearly 3 years since North Korea fully closed down its borders. And in order to understand that full lockdown, we would have to do new research on that because circumstances have changed since the initial phase of COVID-19 and 3 years afterwards. So the questions that I would like to raise is why is North Korea continuing with a long-term lockdown of borders? And second, what were the changes at each border during the COVID-19 crisis? When we talk about a full lockdown of borders, we usually think about borders as a line that goes across between two countries. But the inter-Korean borders actually have geopolitical and natural environmental factors that characterize this region. And I believe that with the introduction of the virus, the borderscape could change quite significantly. And therefore, we have to understand the borders not as a line, but as a space. That's going to be the focus of my presentation. As I mentioned earlier already, we usually understand borders as a line, and that's a blind point or a weak spot. Now you see in the picture that there are lines actually drawn between two Koreas and also between North Korea and China. On the left is a North Korea-China border. On the right is an inter-Korean border marked by a concrete line at the in Panmunjom. But is it really enough to understand the borders as a line? That's going to be the focus of my presentation. I will elaborate later. And when understanding borders, we must not take on a human-centric understanding. So I will explain what that means through this map. Now on the left, this is a map showing how the ASF spread into North Korea. So you can see in the map that the pigs actually crossed the border from China to North Korea. And the pigs that were infected with ASF came down to into South Korea, which is shown in the map on the right. Now, as I said before, understanding borders as a line is not enough to understand what's happening in the border space, because whether it be animals or plants or other types of substances, they can carry viruses through the borders, meaning that perhaps looking at borders as a line is not enough, and that we should understand it as a space. And this is especially important in the era of a pandemic. So, based on those two limitations or blind spots that were the conventional way of thinking, let me elaborate this new concept. So I've given you an abstract picture, picture A and picture 2. Now, picture A, actually you can see that there is a clear division between inside and outside. But as for B, you can see that the boundaries are in dotted line, and there are some spaces that allows you to go into the inside part of the circle or go out to the outside part of the circle. And so I believe that just like you see in the gray area, you can understand borders as this space. And I think we've largely taken on the perspective of picture A rather than picture B. But I think we need to understand the inter-Korean border just like we see in picture B. Now, the picture A, you already know what this is about. The North Korean authorities define COVID-19 as a dirty, demon-like invisible enemy and called its clean territory an inner circle that differentiates it with outside. So the inner circle actually includes land, sea, and air. But let's look at the perspective of B. It's more spatial, it's more process-oriented and relationship-oriented. Because I don't have a lot of time, I cannot elaborate what these pictures are exactly about, but you can see that there is a permeability in picture B compared to picture A. And I believe that there are these holes, these loopholes that exist in borders between countries, like in picture B. We have to think about the geopolitical and also geo-economical aspects of these spaces when understanding borders. And this is why the border between China and North Korea and the border between the two Koreas have starkly different borderscapes. So the process of the formation of the border is as follows, and I'm going to concentrate on the pandemic as I elaborate this. So there are physical factors, institutional factors, discourse factors, human factors, non-human factors that make up the borders. And within the interaction of these elements, created are the unique borderscapes of each border. So based on what I said earlier, we have done some analysis. It's not complete, so I cannot share it with you at this moment. But from a broader point of view, inter-Korean relations and peace on the Korean Peninsula are some things that can be interpreted through this research. And we wanted to do some interpretation of the different borderscape between North Korea and China and between the two Koreas, and I can only give you an overview of that as for now. Now, let's look at this second picture. In 2020, in June, the Kaesong Industrial Complex Liaison Office was blown up by North Korea. During the pandemic period, the borderscape between the two Koreas, when we look at their geopolitical and geo-economical aspect, the geopolitical aspect plays a bigger role than the geo-economic aspect. Now, the Kaesong Industrial Complex's liaison office has been blown up, but the Mount Kumgang Special Zone was also dissolved. The Mount Kumgang Tourism Special Zone is where the inter-Korean tensions was very high, but through geo-economical projects, we wanted to alleviate the geopolitical tension. But again, there was a bombing of the liaison office and disbanding of the facilities at Mount Kumgang, and so the projects were not realized. And this it is very important that we consider the geopolitical factors that play a role within the geo-economical aspect. Now, there is a geopolitical tension between China and North Korea, but they try to make that as invisible as possible. Now, with regards to geo-economical aspect, the cooperation between the two countries still remains solid despite COVID-19, so it's a bit different from the situation of inter-Korean relations. Now, but when COVID-19 spread at a fast rate and everything was uncertain, in Jilin province there is a place called Hoshi Trade Zone, and this trade zone was created to facilitate exchange between the people of China and North Korea, and they actually held a groundbreaking ceremony back in 2021. No real exchanges have been made to date, but from a geo-economic aspect, the fact that they had this groundbreaking ceremony means that there is a possibility for them to engage in active discussion despite COVID-19. And we see a lot of geo-economical movements happening in North Korea. Now, the next picture on the right is a picture of Tumen City, and a scarecrow is installed in China, and it is installed to chase off birds from North Korea that might have been infected by COVID-19. And from a local government perspective, they gave the instruction to the people not to open the windows of their homes or buildings that face North Korea. And we do know that there is a tension between North and South Korea in terms of COVID-19, with North Korea claiming that the COVID-19 virus came from South Korea. And while there is still the impact of COVID-19 between China and North Korea, nevertheless, their exchange has not been suspended entirely. So there is that difference in borderscape between the two borders. And for the time being, when we talk about the borders, it would not be easy for the inter-Korean relations to be thawed in the short term. And there was a party congress that was held recently in North Korea, where North Korea blamed South Korea for being the source of COVID virus that spread across the regime. So, looking at inter-Korean relations in the long term, perhaps we can engage in cooperation in terms of health cooperation, but it's not going to be easy. But looking at it from a more longer term, maybe rather than thinking that North Korea's response against COVID-19 is irrational, it did have its fair reasons. And when we look at the level of exchange between North Korea and China, we need to think about ways to alleviate the geopolitical tensions between the two Koreas and to revive the geo-economic exchange between the two sides. I'm sorry for using up a lot of time, but let me share my conclusion or tentative conclusion. But I'm not going to go over them in detail. You can read them because this is what I've basically talked about so far. So thank you for listening. Thank you, Mr. Hwang Jin-tae. So I think you raised a lot of issues and awareness of those issues. So recently I came across a media report that was rather odd or funny. So recently North Korea held a emergency quarantine meeting and declared the end of the pandemic era in North Korea. And Kim Yo-jong made a remark about how Kim Jong-un suffered from high fever. But what I found puzzling is that after the emergency quarantine measure was executed, she said that Kim Jong-un stepped up to the plate and guided its struggle against the pandemic. And I think he gave a reporter instruction of about 20,000 pages, I think. So I think Kim Yo-jong was trying to convey the message that Kim Jong-un was very enthusiastic and passionate about countering COVID-19. But this shows me that there is no structured system within North Korea to counter the pandemic, that the leader is the one who has to take control of fighting the battle. So that is what I found puzzling. But Mr. Hwang said that when we look at North Korea, we should take some different views rather than the conventional ones. When COVID-19 first broke out, maybe we looked at North Korea with a bias that North Korea is doing this and that because it's abnormal. Why aren't you introducing the vaccines, for example? So because we have this image of an abnormal state for North Korea, we judged everything that North Korea does as being abnormal. I'm not trying to say that North Korea is normal, but depending on the system of a state, we must see whether the state has taken rational steps that are based on their unique national system. So let's take on an objective view when we look at North Korea, and based on our analysis, we ought to come up or formulate measures of what ways we can cooperate with North Korea, but also together with the international community as well. So thank you so much for raising our awareness on the issues, on the way that we view North Korea. Now we will hear from Mr.
So we will hear from Jang Eun-mi, who's going to talk about the social class structural change in North Korea and the rise of the middle class. So I think that it is one of its kind as a research to define the concept of the middle class in North Korea and to have a deep look into this issue. So she's going to share with us her findings as well. Hello, as introduced, I am Jang Eun-mi. Today I'm going to talk about the changes of social structure and middle class in North Korea with a specific focus on the middle class. Until it has been 20 years since markets were legalized in North Korea, and lots of changes happened in terms of the social structure. One of the notable trends is that there is more division of social class, and as a result, we often talk about different social classes that are out there, but there is not enough information about the current status of these different social classes, class groups. So that is why in 2019, I wrote a paper about the determinants of middle classes in North Korea. Actually, it was not a paper but a survey, so it was an exploratory approach. But now I wanted to focus more on the actual changes that are taking place in North Korea, and that is why this year I began conducting this study on middle classes of North Korea. There are a few indices or index that allows us to take stock of the current situation of middle class in DPRK. And the most leading one is the 2017's Wealth Index. So it's called MICS. It's based on the actual assessment of the North's situation. And this index actually looks at the wealth held by individual households. So there are different criteria that are included in this index. And if you look at the breakdown of this index, so 40% upper class, 40% middle class, and also 40% lower class. So we can see a geographical distribution of these social classes. And one notable thing to note is that there is a huge gap between cities and rural areas. So in cities, for example, the upper 40% represents the upper class represents 40%. The upper 40% represents 60%, and also in rural areas, upper 40% represents 8.8. And there's a huge gap between Pyongyang and other countries. For example, upper 40% represent 86% in Pyongyang, but only 17% in Yangon province. So just by looking at these results, we can see that ever since the legalization of markets in DPRK, social class structure has dramatically changed and social disparities have worsened. And of course, North Korea is aware of this issue. I believe that the leadership knows that they should be keen on this issue, and that is why during the 8th Party Congress, it included the goal to bridge the gap, rural and city gap, in its 5-year economic plan. So, as a new policy line of the second term of Kim Jong-un regime, it represented an all-out development as a socialist country. And as part of that initiative, in September 2021, there was the Act on Promoting Development of Cities and Counties adopted, and during the fourth meeting in December 2021, one of the important adoptions made was to improve the agricultural environment or farming environment. And while building the Samjiyon city, North Korea is considering this project as a model project for local or regional development. And there has been an adoption of a new doctrine to promote the new socialist rural construction. Now, out of all of these, I would like to focus on the topic of a middle class, which is also subject to my study. So there is a rise of a middle class as new class in DPRK. And as background for this emergence is that there is an increasing development of markets and trade, and also a promotion of unofficial or non-official economy. So there is also a rise of a nouveau riche called 돈주, and there is increasing income is leading to more purchasing power, activating the consumption market. So you can see these type of economic changes taking place in DPRK. But not only that, in terms of policy, so there is the socialist corporate responsibility oriented policy or management system that is being implemented as part of the economic management reform. So the Corporates Act was amended so that corporates can attract private investment or funding, and that allows more opportunities for the nouveau riche. And the corporates also came to own the workforce adjustment rights, or hold the workforce adjustment rights. So we could see the rise of new types of workers and laborers, and they are participating in unofficial economy. And as for the elite groups, for example, doctors and teachers and technicians, they complained a lot about very low wages, but elite groups are also taking part in unofficial economy. So a lot of changes are taking place in DPRK, which is giving a rise to the middle class. Now, I'm going to skip the example of post-socialist country for the interest of time. But one thing to note from the post-socialist country example is that before the regime transition, there was the middle class who were very much dependent on the state. And after the post-socialism, these types of middle class failed to become independent from states. They remain dependent on states. So rather than playing an important role as promoting democracy, they are very much mired in the past. And as for the middle class from the socialist countries of Asia, so the focus is how massively these types of middle classes came to being. And the middle class of Asian socialist countries became leading consumers, and lots of focus has been placed on middle class as consumers in Vietnam and China. So what about DPRK? How do they view the middle class? So in North Korea, it is very difficult to find the dictionary meaning of a class or hierarchy. So I did some research, but social class or class, the definition does not appear in philosophy dictionary, economic dictionary. Actually, the word class appears in the political dictionary. So if you look at the dictionary textbook definition of middle class, it is actually a social class that is very similar to the economic situation of the small goods producers who actually earn a living based on the individual labor and private ownership of the production means. And these middle class actually captivate the elite groups to implement some improvement measures. And it is true that the elite groups did exist in the past, and we still see these elite groups around. And following the arduous march, it seems like there is a recurrence of the rise of the middle class. So after beginning my research on the DPRK's middle class, it seems like there are lots of theories regarding this topic since the 1970s out there in the world, but it's very difficult to directly apply those principles and theories to DPRK's case because DPRK's case is very complex and unique. So in the class theory, Wright said that the class has very contradictory locations within class relations. So there is the ruler and the person who is ruled. So there are very much contradictory locations within the class relations is what Errico Wright said. And as you may well know, the occupational class and also the social class and economic classes remain in contradiction. So these are some of the examples that I cited. And these people are those I met in person. So there is one person who is a laborer in a small company. So he's doing is involved in official economy, and he's also paying certain contribution to the company to actually do a different job. And he is also employing some others to do his own separate business. And his official occupational status is laborer. But in a private space, he is an employer hiring other employees. He's working in smuggling and trafficking. And there is another person who is a homemaker. So this homemaker or housewife, this person actually hires housewives to assemble electronic appliances components. So she herself is also a housewife. And there's also a doctor. So the doctor occupational status is doctor, but he's also a CEO of a company doing an apparel business. So you can see that in North Korea, there are so many classes that are in contradictory spaces. And that is why it is very difficult to apply the Western hierarchy or social class theory to North Korea's case or situation. Another important thing to note is there is what we call the basis or the ascribed status or 성분. And 성분 really plays a very important role in determining your social class. And Mr. Kim, our panelist, is also he's also doing a research that there is less and less impact of this ascribed status in North DPRK, but 성분 actually allows you to move up the social class or move down the social class. But actually that is not the case in Korea. So there is a very closeness in terms of the class system in North Korea. So who are considered as middle class or middle income class in North Korea is also the focus of the study. When we define the middle class, one of the most used data is the income level. So we look at the median income level. So from 90 to 50 to 150%, and recently it's gone down up to 75 to 200%. The benchmark is always different, but the important indicator that we use is the income level. So as for DPRK, you know that we don't have access to their income level, income data, so it's very difficult to make an assessment. And our team leveraged different channels to gather information, and we estimated that as of 2020, GNI per capita in DPRK is $624, and 70% of that was considered as the median income of DPRK households. And that if that is the case, a four-member household's annual income would be from $655 to $1,747. So we considered these households to be part of the middle class. And we also heard testimonies from the North Korean defectors. Based on the interviews, we learned that on average, they earned about $100 to $300 per month. So that's a four-member household basis. So based on their interview, we also leveraged their interview data as well. So IPUS at Seoul National University conducts an annual study. So we referenced that data and we compared it with the World Bank data, and we came to learn that our assessment was very much aligned with theirs. So this is the structure of the household expenditure. The higher the income, you can see that the food expenditure was reduced. But if you have a social higher class, then the savings actually increased as well. So the middle class in DPRK, their food expenditure does not exceed 50% of their overall expenditure, and they save about 10% of their income. So they do have private capital. They do hold private capital, is what we found. I also mentioned about this MICS index of UNICEF, and as seen also by the IPUS of Seoul National University, we could also make an assessment or estimation about the current status of durable goods held by North Korean households. But there is still a problem of lack of power supply in North Korea, and a lot of households were keen on addressing this problem themselves, so they were purchasing a lot of durable goods to address the power shortage, and that led to increased disparity or gap of holding assets or wealth between households and classes. So, who should we consider it as middle class? What should be the criteria? Some people say that, if you have a cell phone, then you should be considered middle class. Let's have a look at the cell phone status in North Korea. According to UNICEF, about 69% of North Koreans have cell phones. We do not have a clear data or exact data of the number of households in North Korea, but we estimate that there are about 4.54 million households who have cell phones in DPRK. So if you look at the living standards of middle class, you can see that there are new tastes being born. For example, people ate to survive, but they are now eating to their likings, and more interest, growing interest on health and also education. So increasing expenditure for health. So relevant consumables have been developed and sold. In terms of leisure, we see an increasing consumption trend. We see a lot of desire for leisure. And as for the mid to high class, they very much long to travel abroad, but traveling abroad is very much constrained in North Korea. But we could also identify there's a high desire to travel abroad based on our interviews with North Korean defectors. So to sum up, I would like to say that the middle class in DPRK, would they be able to play the role of ensuring stability of a nation like many countries in Asia? Or will the middle class in DPRK play an important leading role as an important force in transforming the politics in North Korea? So that will be the key issue to think about when it comes to middle class of DPRK. Of course, we cannot reach the conclusion right away, and indeed there are constraints, but this topic requires further study. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much, Ms. Jung, Dr. Jung. So that was a very interesting topic. I wish I could have given you more time so that we can fully cover this topic. But if we have some time left at the end, I hope that we will have time to talk more. So this research or study, once the findings are published, I think that they will allow us to have a better understanding, very specific understanding about the current social status of DPRK. In the past, the society or North Korea actually very much valued the 성분 or the ascribed social status. But now the 성분 or the social classes have become very much diversified, is one thing that we noticed. And there's also a change or developments of taste for middle class. So we see a lot of interesting characteristics and demographic changes taking place in DPRK. Last presentation is
It will be given by Mr. Hong Jae-hwan. He studies North Korea's economy at KINU. He's going to talk about human capital development of future generations in North Korea. So, once you're born, up until the age of 18, there's a survival rate and also education and health aspects will also be considered to see human capital development in North Korea. And there will be a inter-country comparison. It was a very interesting study, so I look forward to hearing what the study has found so far. Mr. Hong, over to you. Hello, my name is Hong Jae-hwan from KINU. So, as Mr. Hong Min said, I'm going to talk about human capital development of future generations in North Korea and cooperative measures. Now, the research is ongoing, so we haven't touched upon the cooperative measures yet. We're going to cover them later. So overall, I'm just going to talk about the international discourse on human capital development of future generations. And under this framework of international discourse, how this human capital development is being carried out in North Korea. I'm going to compare North Korea with other countries and talk about how we will do about with regards to our study on cooperative measures. Now, I think we need to talk about the importance of international discourse on human capital development. Now, the human capital, almost everything of human capital is formed at early childhood, especially from fetal period to early childhood, as we can see in various researches. So, they undergo a lot of development at this period in time. And you can see the graph on the right, which shows the rate of ROI in human capital, and you see that the return is higher when people are younger. If they don't undergo enough development in early childhood, it's going to affect them for life. So human capital development in early childhood is very important. Of course, even after early childhood, investment in the accumulation of human capital is still important. Even during late childhood and early adolescence, children still undergo important development phases, and if some developments did not happen in early childhood, they can still make up for that in later childhood. So human capital development from early childhood to up until the age of 18 is very important. But we still lack related investment. Because we're doing the investment now, but we're only going to see the return way later in the future. So underdeveloped countries do not make significant related investments. And the international community say that about 250 million of children under the age of 5 in low-income and middle-income countries are at risk of not being able to realize their development potentials. So while looking at the Human Capital Development Project and something called the care framework or nurturing care framework for early childhood development, I'm going to talk about what countries are doing for their human capital development. Now let's talk about the human capital project first. So the key here is a calculation of human capital index, and the human capital index is defined as the amount of human capital expected to be accumulated by a child born today until the age of 18 under the health and educational conditions of the country. So it's very important to calculate the index and to reinforce research on human capital and also improving the way we measure human capital and identifying policies that is helpful to the development of human capital is also important. Now, when we calculate human capital index, survival and expected years of learning are two important factors, and the quality of education is also considered important. and health, which is related to survival and their health, the level of nutrition, for example, are important. So in sum, the HCI is largely consisted of survival, school, and health. But this index does have its own limitations, which we will have to complement going forward. But with the given indices of today, we're going to look into North Korea's human capital development of future generation. And there is also something called the Nurturing Care Framework for Early Childhood Development implemented by many international organizations. This framework focuses on supporting children from infancy to the age of 3 and good health, adequate nutrition, responsive caregiving, which might sound new to you, but opportunities for early learning and security and safety are the 5 components of nurturing care according to the framework. And the 5 components are broken down here in this table to see their key contents and with what indicators are we going to make an evaluation of those components. And the international community is making proposals about ways to further promote those 5 components of nurturing care. This is what that slide is about. And next, I would like to talk about the support strategies. There are 5 components in the support strategies, as you can see in the presentation material. And this will be a part of the report that is to be written later. And when we look at North Korea from an international standard, how is North Korea doing in terms of its human capital development of future generations? Now, let's take a look at its human capital index first. International reports do not contain data about North Korea, so I had to do the calculation of my own, and I took into consideration these 4 to 5 elements, but the thing is, North Korea does not have a score pertaining to the program for international student assessment. So I had to do the calculation on my own. I had to do some indirect calculation. I think the total score is 640 in terms of PISA. But based on my calculation, North Korea scores at 400. This is not accurate, but I do not have any indicators, so I use that number 400. Now, I compared North Korea to 150 countries that are evaluated by the international community, and survival rate and expected years of learning and the rate of malnutrition in children under the age of 5. I think you can basically say that this is children whose height is shorter than that of kids of their peers. And there's also the survival rate of children until the age of 5 and also the survival rate of adults. And after making this comparison, we found that North Korea's human capital index is similar to the average of middle-income country groups. And as I said before, I calculated the PISA score myself, and this was basically also similar to middle-income country groups. So the next indicator is related to the care framework. And I don't have any scores or quotient on this. The UNICEF does provide related information. And it does have figures in various indicators, and North Korea is also included. So I made a comparison of about 150 countries, North Korea related, and the outcome is as follows. So it indicates mortality rate of children under 5, maternal mortality rate, premature birth, and other indicators that relates to childhood development. And overall, we made the conclusion that North Korea is doing fairly well among low and middle income countries. And the next slide shows the 5 components of care, like nutrition and good health. And you can see that among low and middle income countries, North Korea is doing pretty well in this area. So when we take all of these findings into consideration, we can say that North Korea's human capital development of future generation is doing fairly well compared to its level of income. But when we look at it from an absolute standard, there are still a lot of room for improvement. And there are some other things to consider. There are possibilities that we are over-evaluating the current state of North Korea. There could have been some bias in sampling, and people may have responded to the questions differently from what the reality is. So we are going to, going forward, incorporate the testimonies of North Korean defectors in order to make improvements with regards to these issues. So this is a part of the research that we need to do more work on. So how are we going to find ways for cooperation? We're largely looking into 2 things. One is, to date, the development, we have to look into how the development cooperation between the 2 Koreas took place with regards to children. They can be broken down into healthcare and food aid. South Korea has taken up a large portion of the entire assistance that goes into North Korea, so I think we can focus on that. But starting from 2010, the international community began to increasingly play a bigger role. And we have to also focus on the fact that there is a lack of investment in the educational era, so maybe we can cooperate in terms of training teachers. And in healthcare, we can provide food and basic health care as well as vaccine provision. And we can also refer to successful related cases in other countries. So research is still ongoing. We can break that down into 2 areas, education and health. We can support teachers or refer to the ICT transforming education. Or in healthcare, we can refer to eradication of intestinal parasites and scaling up nutrition movement and many more. So we will put those all together so as to find in what areas we can cooperate for the development of children in North Korea. So I'm almost to the end of my presentation. And what we're also trying to especially look at is improvement of faculty welfare, as well as programs that are connected to schools, and to establish a sustainable system that will allow this to still be continued in North Korea, even after the support projects are over. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Dr. Hong Jae-hwang. It was a very interesting presentation. And I know that you don't have the final outcome of the study yet, so we look forward to seeing that in the future. And your past researches really interest me too. You saw how North Korea is doing compared to low-income countries, and how North Korea was able to make a fast recovery from arduous march in terms of poverty and malnutrition in children and so on. And that analysis was very interesting. And I also find this research very interesting as well. But you did talk about the risk of over-evaluating in North Korea. And that's something that we must focus on going forward. And in terms of seeking for ways to cooperate, I'm sure that your research will be able to make some of those future projects more realistic. So let's now end the presentation here. Let's go into discussion. Our first discussant is Mr. Park Bae-gyun, or Professor Park Bae-gyun. So I was not able to introduce Mr. Hwang Jin-tae in detail, but he actually majored in geography. But here in KINU, we usually have people who majored in politics, for example, but we have Mr. Hwang Jin-tae who can offer a geological point of view in terms of our research. So he's a valuable asset to KINU. And so, therefore, we invited Professor Park Bae-gyun, who is a professor at the Department of Geography Education. So we like to hear his remarks. Dr. Park?
As introduced, I am Park Bae-gyun. So I majored in political geography, and I also studied a lot on the topic of territoriality. So Dr. Hwang's presentation, as well as all the other presenters' presentations, were interesting. About the Human Development Capital Index and the middle class, and also I do relate with the problem statement of Dr. Hwang. If you consider North Korea as an abnormal country, then we would miss out on a lot of things. So North Korea did indeed go through a lot of crises, including the arduous march. And in South Korea, the political circles and the media tend to focus on those aspects. But despite all of those challenges, we may have some hope for the future generations of DPRK, is an interesting remark. So I would like to focus my panelists on the presentation of Dr. Hwang.
So you did your research on North Korea's border lockdown after the pandemic. And after the pandemic, many countries did close down their borders, which means that their sense of territory has become stronger. So when COVID-19 was prevalent, everyone talked about even the apocalypse in the media. And at the same time, industrial capital began to play a greater role, especially with the US-China conflict and US-Ukraine war. Some scholars who are critical of the West say that there is a conflict of money and conflict of industrial asset and capital intensifying in this world. So with the advent of the globalization is really about financial capital. But now territories are being more emphasized. And closely linked to territory is industrial capital, which is gaining importance. And all of this began to be exacerbated with the emergence of COVID-19 and also border lockdown. At a time when a sense of territory is becoming emphasized, modern capital is not comprised of territory alone. People who look at territories from a security point of view say that the borders actually serve to contain the country, but the territory in the modern country is actually more comprised of the tensions that actually arise from the movement across the borders. And so the logic of territory and logic of economy actually both exist in a state. And with regards to the tension between the movement and also fixation, it's actually what comprises the political system of a country. So we cannot just explain a state with the logic of territory and security, but we also should understand it through the logic of movement and flow. So I think that was the main issue that was raised in Dr. Hwang's presentation. Even with COVID-19, North Korea cannot survive with border closure alone. In other words, with its territory alone. It must go beyond its territory at the same time to engage with them. Economy always exists regardless of what the state does. So there should be a simultaneous effort to continue on with that cross-border movement by a state. And the territory and the border and the movements that they're in also is pertinent to North Korea. That was well shown in Mr. Hwang's presentation. And it looks like North Korea does have its own legitimacy in the way that they respond to COVID-19. And I agree with what you said. But I do have a question or a point that I'm curious about. You talked about the limitations of the human-centric viewpoint when it comes to borders. And we have to also consider non-human elements when we look at the border issue, is what you said. But with regards to COVID, how is that being played out? When it comes to inter-Korean relations, there is a geopolitical tension that is becoming emphasized, whereas the geo-economic tension between China and North Korea is being emphasized in their border. Now, there is a high possibility that COVID-19 probably came into North Korea from China, but because of its current circumstances, North Korea actually puts the blame on South Korea and intensifies a COVID-related tension with South Korea rather than China. Now, so how can we interpret this situation in the context of human and non-human elements? That's the question that I want to raise to you. Perhaps if we have time, you can address that question. I would appreciate it.
I have a question about the middle class and your study. At the last part of your presentation, you mentioned about the role of middle class. So not only for DPRK, but for the world, is the middle class somebody who tries to stabilize society or the main driver of democracy or democratization? I think that we can take a different perspective from the Northeast Asian side. So when it comes to China, Korea, and Japan, in our countries, the middle class served as a speculator, as the agent for speculation. And I don't know if speculative urbanization is how serious in North Korea, but the middle class can serve as the driver for democracy, but also can they play the role as a speculator, agent of speculation. Thank you very much. I think that our presenters took note of the questions, and there were also some interesting questions raised in the discussions. So regarding, of course, territoriality is important, but how can that issue be connected with division? I think that we have to really look into the intrinsic nature. And you also mentioned about the non-human aspect and how that plays in, or how that is factored in with regards to the division of the Korean Peninsula. I would like to ask that question for the presenter, because especially in North Korea, raise issues about the propaganda leaflets that come from South Korea. So there are also other examples that we can cite. So I would like to know if you have comments regarding this in light of the COVID situation. And the second discussion was made by Professor Kim Byung-nu. So he is indeed an expert in North Korean issue, and we always learn a lot from him. So let me introduce to you the second panelist. Yes, that I am Byung-nu Kim. It's a pleasure to see you. I feel like I am giving a speech in a 10,000-seat stadium. There's a lot of howling and echoing here. I think it's gotten a little bit better in terms of the microphone, but it's a very unique and new experience. I feel like I'm speaking in front of a very large crowd, as if, this room is bustling with people. So in that sense, I am very much excited to talk to you. So Dr. Jung shared with us her intermediary findings about the study on middle class. So regarding the middle class, this has been the topic of study since Aristotle's era. So in Aristotle says the perfect political community is a political community dominated by the middle class, is what he said. And the middle class should be also larger in number compared to the upper and the lower class. So it is based on that theory that there's been a lot of analysis on the role of the middle class and what they are until now. But regarding DPRK, the topic was not of a deep study, but it is very promising that Dr. Jung decided to take on this study. Especially when it comes to the middle class, according to the international norms, we consider the middle class to be the 40% of the entire population. And we tend to use different indicators in the fields of education and health to compare the middle class with the lower and the upper class. In that sense, I would like to appreciate the approach that Dr. Jung took. So now I'd like to share with you two important considerations. So who are they really? So, you talked about the 40% of the middle class. But if we delve deeper into the concept of social class and social hierarchy, we really have to have a deeper understanding of who really constitute this middle class people. And Dr. Jung touched upon it slightly, but there are also merchant class who are entering the middle class. If you look into North Korea's history, there were people who were selling things in the marketplace in North Korea, but there are also new types of merchants that are flowing into the middle class, and the merchant class are usually come from the middle class. Currently, we are talking about 1.2 million or 1.4 million people who are active population. So and also the middle class. So out of all of this middle class population, if you can have a deep laser focus on the merchant class, I think that may also require a study on middle or higher class. So I would like to suggest that maybe we can also do further study on the merchant class out of the middle class. And that topic is very much related with the role of the middle class. So the middle class usually served as a social stabilizer and also the driver for democracy, but would they be able to play the role of a reformer? Especially in the transitional justice, there were lots of citizens' movements, and middle class played an important role, and that also goes for South Korea during the democratization process. A lot of white-collar workers took down to the streets to seek changes. So Dr. Chung mentioned about the role of middle class in the socialist countries. So if you look at China or Vietnam, middle class used to closely be connected to high class or high ranking officials. So that is why it would be also impossible or limited for North Korean middle class to play that kind of role, play the kind of a reform role or innovation role. But usually, sometimes, or oftentimes, the middle class plays an important role in also creating agitation in the society, meaning that when there's a rise of the merchant class, because that can lead to a class conflict with the higher class, and that is why, in order to ease the complaints of the upper class, the government tends to deploy or distribute housing or houses to the upper class. We have seen cases like that in the past. So it seems like the rise of the middle class is entailing a lot of inflow of merchant class, and that could cause instability in the society, cause more conflicts, and probably also change the regime. That's the kind of question I would like to ask. So these are two questions that I wanted to ask to Dr. Chung, and that leaves me with my last question. So as Dr. Hwang explained, why did North Korea go for an all-out full lockdown, full closing of its borders? So he gave us some very structural explanations and interpretations. But I think that requires also a one direct explanation, meaning that the leadership in DPRK also has a lot of fear about the regime collapse, regime fall. And COVID-19 pandemic is something that is unprecedented in North Korea and also around the world. And North Korea was very vulnerable in responding to this crisis. And the leadership was very much afraid that their regime would collapse. And maybe that explains the full lockdown. And Kim Jong-un also said that he had to assume that maybe the nation's destiny would fall because of COVID-19. And the quarantine experience is quite limited. It's almost zero in North Korea, and they didn't know what kind of measures to take, and that is why they had to take a wait-and-see approach, go for a all-out closing. But would the full lockdown likely to continue? Very difficult. In order to have a full lockdown, you have to have vaccines distributed and you have to be vaccinated. But there is also a lot of fear surrounding vaccines in North Korea. I don't know if you know, but when U.S. caught bin Laden, actually they waged a polio campaign to kill bin Laden. North Korea is aware of that campaign, so they fear that if they try to get vaccines through different channels, then that may lead to the regime's collapse. And maybe they are trying to get vaccines with the assurance from China and Russia. So this is the kind of situation North is faced with in the COVID era. And there is a growing fear or constant fear that the regime may collapse. But this fear is not very much visible to the general public and to the experts because we are very much focused on the talk of denuclearization. So I think there should be a more detailed and specific awareness about why North Korea decided to go for a full lockdown for many years. Thank you very much.
So there were some really insightful questions, especially the possibility of a class conflict. And your last question pertaining to Dr. Hwang is also very interesting. So we don't have a lot of time left. I think we might have to go over time. And I apologize for having Mr. Mitsuhiro Mimura to wait for a long time because you waited for a long time. I don't think I could tell you that you have to make your comment short. So please use the next 7 to 8 minutes to make a comment. So he is a renowned researcher in North Korean issues, and he's visited North Korea many times. So he saw the current state of North Korea's economy and politics and etc. with his own eyes and conducted studies based on his own experiences. So I'm sure he can touch upon some of the micro issues pertaining to North Korea. So please, Mr. Mimura. Hello, my name is Mitsuhiro Mimura from Japan. So thank you so much, Mr. Hong, for your presentation. Your presentation talked about human capital development of human future generations in North Korea, and you gave us some objective statistics. And based on those statistics, you were able to come up with an objective indicator that allowed you to compare North Korea with other countries. The research was indeed significant. I believe that we need to continue with such attempts and try to continue with future researches that would allow the figures that you calculated to be matched closer to reality. I will make my remarks short. So you talked about future generations today, but back in 1995 to 1997, North Korea suffered a severe famine. From early 90s to late 90s, the children who were born at the time are in their late 20s and early 30s. Among North Korean defectors, those who were born at that time actually agree to do some MRI. If they can agree to do some MRI testing, for example, I think that the outcome would be very supportive of the research that you have done. And in late 70s to early to mid 80s, the South Korean people also suffer some malnutrition. So I believe that perhaps the outcome of that MRI testing would be similar to that of South Koreans who were born that time. Now, I would like to go into page 6 of your presentation with regards to PISA score. You said you calculated your own score because you did not have that information related to North Korea. Maybe you could conduct this test on North Korean defectors. Actually, you did say that you did. And if you look at people who came to South Korea from North Korea, they're usually from North and South Hamgyong province and Chagang province, mostly from the northern part of the country. So we cannot say that the North Korean defectors represent the North Korean population as a whole. So when you are going to supplement the figures that you calculated, are you going to take that into consideration to see what the limitations are? And there are also figures related to the gap between regions, as said in the second presentation. So I think you can also refer to that. And my second question to you is this. It's pretty much similar to what I've just said. But you said that North Korea's PISA score is estimated at 400. I wonder how the figures will change if you raise that 400 to a higher score. In the case of North Korea, it's not the quantity of education, but the quality of education that is the problem. And in terms of quality of education, what's really key here is the power to think. The thinking skills is one of the biggest differentiator when it comes to differences between North Korea and South Korea. So will you be making any relevant comments in your research about that? That's my second question. And the third question, or maybe I could call it a comment. In page 21, you reviewed past cases of international cooperation projects. You said you will refer to them going forward when seeking ways to cooperate with North Korea. I would say that back in 1960s, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. But it did achieve rapid economic development. After the arduous march, North Korea, in its own ways, have made a lot of efforts for social and economic development. Now, there are countries in Middle East, Latin America, and Africa who engaged in these international projects that you mentioned, and perhaps you could get those countries involved when you are working together with North Korea. Of course, North Korea does need assistance, but North Korea in its own way have supported other countries in Africa and Latin America. So maybe going forward, the two Koreans can work together to conduct a program that would support these lower income countries together. There can be vertical programs, but this could also lead ways to horizontal programs. And this could serve as an opportunity to conduct a wide range of programs between the two Koreas. If you can embark on this joint project first, I think North Korea would find that appealing. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Mitsuhiro. And we are sorry that you had to wait for a long time. I'm sorry that I could not allocate a lot of time for you. Now that concludes the discussion session. And we are taking questions online and also from the floor. Does anyone from the floor have any questions? Okay. Dr. Kwon Young, can you give him the microphone?
I have a question for Dr. Hong.
So the human capital index, maybe the concept is just too broad. We talk about many indicators when we talk about health. And because the human capital index basically encompasses all of these indicators, I think it's just too broad. Amid the circumstances of the 21st century, the things that we ought to consider when talking about human capital development is the rate at which we learn a digital economy, for example. So I think digital economy should be included, but I'd like to ask your opinion on that. Thank you very much for the question. I don't know, Dr. Hong, if you have enough time to answer this question, but if you could, I'd like for you to address that question. We do have a question online for Dr. Chung and me.
So Professor Kim can also answer the question. So you mentioned about the defectors that you interviewed for your study. So in the process, were they aware of the rise of middle class, about the definition and the concept of middle class, and did they consider themselves as middle class? And actually, in DPRK, people tend, or the government or the regime tend to ignore the existence of 돈주s or the nouveau riche. But is it something that we can continue to ignore going forward? So maybe you can provide the answers to this question. Fortunately, there is no session after this session. So, although as a moderator, I did not manage time well, I think that I can give you 5 minutes to give the answer. Maybe we can change the order. So maybe Dr. Huang can take the floor first. Thank you very much for that comment. And thank you very much, Professor Park and Dr. Mitsuhiro, for your remarks.
Now, you talked about the influence of non-human factors that played a role in forming borders. Now, non-human factors are beyond our expectation. They act beyond our expectation and anticipation, so we must consider that. So as part of its emergency measures, North Korea did employ a full lockdown of its borders, and it did risk its economic benefits to that end. That actually shows the agency of the non-human elements. And North Korea has previous experiences with viruses, but as the interview said, the incubation period is uncertain, it's a very long time, and it spreads very fast. So this is something that was beyond human anticipation and prediction. So that it basically serves as a testimony to North Korea's measure. And also, there's the yellow dust that comes from China, and there is a possibility that COVID-19 viruses can be carried by that yellow dust. So North Korea prevented its people from going outside homes. But anyway, the interest in non-human elements is rising not only on the Korean Peninsula, but when we look at the studies on political affairs of different countries, there are many researchers reflect that non-human element. So this is a global trend, there's a global acknowledgement of the influence of these non-human elements. But I'm not saying that I'm not trying to focus on the fact that these non-human elements have vigor and that they play the key role. Humans actually do play an important role. As said by Mr. Hong Min, Kim Yo-jong argues that the COVID-19 virus came to North Korea from South Korea. But before that announcement was made, North Korea did import many supplies from China so as to prepare for a big celebration in the regime. So there's a higher possibility that the virus came from China. But so I told you that there is a high geopolitical tension between the two Koreas, whereas there is an effort by the North to strengthen its geo-economical tension between China and South Korea. So even if the virus indeed came from China, it's more likely that North Korea would just blame South Korea for it. So it's not just non-human factors that play a role in North Korea's decision, but we must also consider the human factors as well. And I also agreed with what Mr. Kim Byung-ro said. We ought not to just focus on borders and space only, but also consider the leaders and the North Korea elites going forward. And Mr. Hong Min told us about the political aspect, and yes, these opportunities or these risks actually pose opportunities that we can take advantage of. But I don't think I have time to elaborate that now. But hopefully we can incorporate that in the booklet that is to be published.
Dr. Zhang. Yes, I knew that a lot of questions would come in because it is indeed a topic of interest. So given the Northeast Asian perspective, is there also speculative urbanization taking place in North Korea? Actually, the biggest driver for accumulating wealth in any part of the world is property market, and we are also seeing that kind of trend in DPRK. So Donjus, the nouveau riche, are buying in empty houses, renovating it, and renting them out. So these trends are quite common in DPRK.
그리고 어떤 사람들은 재개발 구역에서의 우리랑 마찬가지로 똑같이 그 정보를
And
먼저
some nouveau riche or donjus, they obtain information about the redevelopment projects, and they are the first to acquire or purchase like newly redeveloped homes and so forth. So these types of speculative activities are going on. And as Professor Kim said,
한 슬라이드가
I
빠졌다라는 거를
actually,
발견하게 됐는데
while listening to the discussion of Professor Kim, I realized that one slide was missing from my presentation, and it's very much related with what Professor Kim said. Actually, it's about who are these middle class in North Korea. There are three types of middle class. So there is the power, expert, and also other types of middle class, and that slide was missing from my presentation.
그런 부분에서 이제 우리 그 용어에서도 알 수 있듯이
As you can see from the terminology,
정부나 군 이러한 데서 어떤 중간 관리의 권력을 가지고 그 권력
it's about people who have a middle level power in the regime and also in the companies and so forth. And there are middle classes who receive and give bribes, but there are also elite groups with professional knowledge and expertise who belong to the middle class. And I also mentioned about very successful merchant classes who are considered as the middle class as well. And I didn't elaborate on that during my presentation. My apologies.
중산층의 성장이 사회 불안정을 이제 증가시키는 요소가 될 수 있지 않느냐.
So in the mid to long term, you may think that the middle class may cause as a source of conflict, increasing uncertainty and instability in DPRK society. And that is why there are also efforts made to counter that. For example, the regime is making sure to ensure more participation of the middle class in the state-led projects and programs so that the wealth that they accumulate will not only stay with themselves but be also transferred to the public sector. And that is one of the initiatives being made by the regime.
그래서 이제 그러한 잠재적인 요소들이 분명히 있고 또 그런
So these are some of the potential scenarios. And in order to address the sense of deprivation of the upper class, there are lots of public goods that are primarily assigned to the upper class to ease their complaints. So these are some of the complementary approaches being adopted. But what is for certain is that in the long term,
를 요구하는 어떤 밑으로부터의 그런 그 힘이 축적되는 그런
this will serve as the process of accumulating the force from bottom to up to eventually change the social structure of North Korea. So we don't have a lot of time, but I hope that we will have chance to discuss more later. Dr. Hong.
So Mr. Mimura said that I actually incorporated the PISA score of the North Korean defectors in my research, and I do know that they don't represent the entire North Korean population, but I couldn't help but to do so because I didn't have any other data available. So the report approaches this with caution, but perhaps there are some room for improvement. Thank you for making a related suggestion. And if the score is to be higher than 400, then it's not going to probably have a great impact on the indicators still. But I do believe we need to take that into consideration. And as for joint programs between the two Koreas, yes, we will consider that going forward. And Dr. Kwon talked about the human capital index and that we must incorporate our skills of digital economy. But This study was focusing on North Korea within the framework of international discourse on human capital development, and therefore we refer to the existing indicators, and it does have its limitations. With regards to digital economy, low-income countries still do not have acquired necessary skills. So going forward, I'm sorry. So yeah, this is why precisely these existing indicators do not take digital economy into consideration. Thank you very much for addressing the questions and comments. We are well over time, so we would like to end the session here for today. So that was session 9-1, North Korea's response in the pandemic era and social economic structure, and we would like to end here. Now, pandemic is a really big topic these days. And North Korea, as it lives through this pandemic era, has shown many different changes, and the three presentations and the discussants have mentioned those changes. Thank you very much. I express my appreciation to all the discussants, especially Mr. Mitsuhiro Mimura, who has joined us from Japan, has waited for a long time. And last but not least, I would like to also thank the audience for listening to today's presentation and discussions. That concludes the session. Thank you very much.
With that, we will wrap up the last session of the day. Thank you very much, dear participants.